The war on drugs in the Philippines was not merely a passing security campaign, it became one of the most controversial experiments of the 21st century. While the media promoted a shining slogan about a president who armed the people and declared war on the mafia, the facts revealed a far more complex reality, one where propaganda intertwined with legal boundaries and presidential orders intersected with stories from impoverished neighborhoods that turned into theaters of death. Since Rodrigo Duterte rose to power in 2016, a loud campaign was launched against shabu, methamphetamine, and criminal networks. Yet it quickly transformed into a testing ground between strict security and human rights, between promises of cleansing and accusations of extrajudicial killings, leading all the way to the president himself being pursued before the International Criminal Court. This is not merely a story about the Philippines, but about a nation caught between the hammer of crime and the anvil of authority, and about a society divided between those who saw Duterte as the punitive savior and those who viewed him as the prime suspect. In this video, we'll trace the roots of this war, from police operations such as Tokang and Double Barrel, and explore how documentaries shaped its visual memory, all the way to The Hague, where international law is being tested against an internal war whose scars have yet to fade. Stay with us until the end, and don't forget to support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel to stay updated with all our new content. When Rodrigo Duterte assumed the presidency in June 2016, a national security campaign against methamphetamine, shabu, was launched. This was not merely a police plan, but a confrontational, authoritarian discourse that redefined the relationship between the state and crime. The campaign's onset came with a sharp tone from the top of the political hierarchy, which quickly manifested on the streets in the form of vigilantism and a marked increase in violence. It was here that the war on drugs began to shift from a promise of deterrence to a debate over extrajudicial killings. Figures and descriptions clashed, and interpretations of events varied between armed confrontations with suspects and a recurring pattern of executions. In this sense, what is historically established is the launch of a large-scale state-led campaign against the shabu market, which produced a heavy human cost and a lasting visual memory. Conversely, exaggerated or incompletely documented media narratives emerged, most notably turning the slogan "Arming the People" into the image of a permanently activated system. It is important to distinguish between the mobilization rhetoric that served the iron fist narrative and the legal limits that restrained turning society into an armed enforcement apparatus. Official regulatory texts restricted the carrying of weapons outside authorized frameworks, meaning that arming remained within the realm of political discourse rather than institutional implementation. Accordingly, what is unverified is the claim of a permanent armed popular mobilization, while what is established is that the campaign entrenched a high-cost security equation, morally and socially, and that debates around it will remain open as long as the gap persists between deterrence rhetoric and the rule of law. The idea originated at the very top of the power hierarchy when, in 2018, Rodrigo Duterte hinted at the possibility of arming barangay, village chiefs, and certain volunteers known as Barangay Tanod with light weapons to combat crime in neighborhoods. He spoke about providing shotguns to village chiefs and .22 caliber pistols to volunteers after they underwent training. The idea drew applause from supporters of the Iron Fist, but it remained within the realm of political rhetoric and never became codified policy. On the ground, the proposal collided with the strict firearm regulations in the Philippines. Republic Act No. 10,591, known as the Firearms and Ammunition Regulation Act, confines licensing, ownership, and carrying of weapons within a centralized system. Carrying a firearm outside one's home requires a special permit called the PTCFOR, issued by the Philippine National Police. The law did not grant auxiliary police units, including the Tanod, the right to carry weapons merely by virtue of their role. Consequently, the Department of the Interior and Local Government, DILG, issued Memorandum Circular MC 2018-16 to remind governors and mayors that TANAD and other auxiliary personnel were not allowed to carry firearms while on duty, and to mandate the return of any weapons previously issued to them. A regional circular further clarified that RA 10591 had nullified any prior authority that allowed auxiliary police units, PAU, to carry weapons under old memoranda. The legal conclusion was clear. There was no state-sanctioned armed popular mobilization. Due to ongoing confusion in public discourse, the DILG in 2021 reaffirmed following a shooting incident in the Tondo area that TANAD carrying firearms while on duty was illegal. This served as a practical signal that what was proposed in 2018 had never been converted into executive regulations allowing arming. Thus, the distinction became evident between the mobilization rhetoric, which aimed to morally arm the community, and the legal framework, which restricted firearm possession and prevented the idea from turning into an armed popular mobilization. The war on drugs in the Philippines also began with a unified police plan known as Oplan Double Barrel. While its concept was simple, its impact was profound. The plan operated on two axes. The first, called the low barrel, targeted the broad base of users and small-time dealers, while the second, known as the high barrel, focused on the major figures and network leaders. In the first component, Oplan Tokang, police teams moved locally, knocking on doors and addressing suspects directly, urging them to surrender, sign pledges, enter rehabilitation programs, or submit to community monitoring. This mechanism relied on locally compiled watch lists within the barangays and operated under the logic of close deterrence, with known neighborhood figures participating to reduce friction and create direct social pressure. The second component targeted network leaders, or high-value targets, HVTS. It relied on intensive intelligence work, including ambushes known as buy-busts, raids on methamphetamine manufacturing workshops, and tracking financing and transport networks. Specialized units were deployed, and information-sharing channels between police and other agencies were activated to strike at masterminds, rather than merely the lower-level operatives. However, the political rhetoric accompanying the plan had a profound effect on its trajectory. Direct statements from leadership, such as "shoot if they resist," coupled with overt disregard for human rights, shifted the plan from a law enforcement measure to a harsh field environment. Soon, mere suspicion coupled with the notion of resistance became enough to turn door-to-door visits into armed confrontations. This fueled growing narratives of extrajudicial killings under the pretext of resisting arrest. Over time, entire neighborhoods became theaters of nightly clashes, with checkpoints and short-term raids, leaving a direct social impact on families whose names appeared on blacklists. The death toll in the Philippines' war on drugs varies significantly depending on the source. While the Philippine Drug Enforcement Agency and the National Police report approximately 6,200 to 6,250 deaths by mid-2022, the Commission on Human Rights estimates a minimum of over 8,600 deaths since 2016, noting that the actual number could be much higher. The discrepancy is not only political, but also methodological. The government classifies these cases as deaths in legitimate operations, whereas human rights organizations categorize them as extrajudicial killings and even include other categories not recorded officially, such as crimes under investigation or killings by unknown assailants. This raises a critical question. Are we witnessing law enforcement actions against armed suspects, or a recurring pattern of excessive use of force? To understand these discrepancies, data journalists and academic centers have built independent databases. The most notable is the DAHAS project at the University of the Philippines, followed by maps produced by the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, showing the temporal and spatial distribution of cases. These maps reveal that the violence is nationwide, not confined to Metro Manila, extending across entire provinces. incidences, indicating a systemic phenomenon rather than isolated waves. A stark example is the so-called Bloody Night in Bulacan on August 15th to 16th, 2017, during which 32 people were killed in just 24 hours as part of a campaign called One Time, Big Time. Incidents like these help explain why the gap between government and independent statistics is structural rather than incidental, and why kill maps have become essential tools for understanding the geography of the conflict, beyond relying solely on official data. Before rising to the presidency, Rodrigo Duterte had already crafted his tough image in Davao City, where human rights reports documented a pattern of coordinated assassinations known in the media as the Davao Death Squad. These operations primarily targeted suspected criminals and drug offenders, turning the city into a model of decisive action, one repeatedly invoked whenever debates over extrajudicial killings resurfaced. A Human Rights Watch report included testimonies from victims' families and reconstructed recurring scenes of killings carried out with similar methods across Davao and neighboring cities, forming a historical foundation for understanding the security narrative that preceded Duterte's move to the presidential palace. When the so-called Davao School expanded to the national stage, the 2019 Ninja Cops scandal erupted, exposing allegations that several police officers had been recycling confiscated drugs, particularly shabu, and selling portions on the black market instead of destroying them. The scandal reached its peak when suspicions implicated then-police chief Oscar Albayalde in connection with a 2013 Pampanga operation and the serious irregularities that followed. Senate committees recommended harsh disciplinary measures, and Albayalde eventually resigned under pressure from the investigations. At that moment, the slogan, "The State versus the Mafia," began to crumble, revealing that the drug economy was capable of seeping through the cracks of the very institution meant to fight it, and that public trust collapses when it becomes clear that some guardians of the law are part of the problem. And while corruption within law enforcement agencies undermines the war on drugs, the picture becomes even more complex when it turns out that drug networks were being run from inside the National Penitentiary itself, New Bilibid Prison. Since the 2014 raids known as Oplan Galagad, and through subsequent operations, glaring violations and illicit privileges were uncovered within the high-security inmates' quarters. Cash, communication devices, and even recreational facilities alongside evidence of continued shabu circulation. These revelations reinforced the impression that parts of the prison had turned into an operational hub rather than the end point of the criminal chain. Amid this environment, politically charged security accusations surfaced, naming former officials, prison staff, and influential figures as facilitators of drug trading from within the facility. Later, some of these individuals were acquitted, while others saw their cases overturned or contradicted in court, and the media leaving a fragmented picture that blended judicial facts revealed in hearings with media narratives riddled with gaps and politicization. Around the Philippine War on Drugs, 3 layers of narratives have accumulated, each requiring calm deconstruction to distinguish what is substantiated from what is fabricated. The first layer emerged from parliamentary testimony by a retired police officer who alleged the existence of a reward system that incentivized some officers to kill suspects. The claim shook public opinion, as it suggested that killing was not the outcome of confrontation, but rather the result of a direct financial incentive. However, this account remains under investigation and has not yet matured into a judicially established fact. It therefore stays within the realm of allegation, one that demands solid evidence and careful forensic review to avoid premature moral or legal condemnation before verification. The second layer appeared with the arrest of former President Duterte in March 2025, when waves of digital misinformation exploded. Old photos were recirculated as if depicting recent protests. Fabricated quotes were falsely attributed to officials and judges, and fake claims about court rulings such as suspended proceedings or the release of suspects spread widely before being officially denied. This digital chaos revealed the deep entrenchment of disinformation ecosystems in the Philippines, where competing accounts race to shape instant public opinion. The golden rule, therefore, remains: always return to primary sources' official statements or court records, and verify the date and context of images before sharing them. The third layer concerns the battle of narratives that has polarized public discourse. Supporters view Duterte's prosecution before the International Criminal Court as merely a tool of domestic political retribution, while human rights advocates argue that the case's essence lies not in political rivalry, but in allegations of crimes against humanity committed under the umbrella of the war on drugs. Today, two contrasting visions intersect in the Philippines: the discourse of strict security associated with Duterte and the discourse of procedural justice that his successor, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., has sought to establish since taking office in 2022. Marcos introduced what he called a bloodless war, continuing large-scale Shabu seizures while recording a notable decline in the number of deaths. He also sought to highlight alternatives based on rehabilitation and prevention, rather than purely confrontational enforcement. However, this new rhetoric does not erase the fact that the roots of the drug economy remain deeply embedded in structural poverty. The expansion of the informal economy and institutional corruption factors that cannot be eradicated by swift decrees or mere shifts in political language. The question remains: has the methodology truly changed, or only the vocabulary? A serious approach requires transparency, independent oversight, and internal accountability. Success should not be measured by the volume of drug seizures alone, but by fair trials, reduced demand through education and employment, and the restoration of public trust, proving that security can coexist with the rule of law. In conclusion, effectiveness is not measured by the number of seizures or deaths, but by the state's ability to restore people's faith in justice through honest institutions, transparent accountability, and genuine efforts to address the roots of poverty and unemployment, transforming the war from a reactive campaign into the true construction of a state governed by law. And with that, we reach the end of today's video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming content.